ChatGPT said, "The village looked like any ordinary place on the map, a tiny dot near the border that most people would never think about. A few houses made from clay, some small farms, and a main road that stayed empty most of the day. It was quiet in the daytime and almost unbelievably silent at night. From far away, it looked peaceful. But something had been disturbing the peace beneath the ground for weeks, and nobody knew what it was. People there said the earth had started breathing. That was their way of describing it. At night, when the wind stopped and even the animals slept, the ground would tremble faintly, like someone was knocking softly from under the soil. Not shaking hard, not enough to scare people, just enough to confuse them. It bothered the villagers who lived close to the hills. They would wake up at night, sit outside their homes, and listen to the soft vibrations passing under their feet. Nobody knew why it was happening, and most people stopped talking about it because they did not want to sound foolish. A team of young geologists was sent from the city to study the land. Their work was simple: collect samples, check the soil, and help the government decide if a road could be built nearby. They were not famous scientists, just students and researchers hoping to earn experience and maybe a recommendation for a bigger job someday. They traveled for 2 days to reach the village, expecting boredom, long hours of digging, and dusty clothes. They had no idea that they were walking into something no one was supposed to find. As soon as they arrived, the villagers looked at them with curiosity. Strangers were rare. The team introduced themselves, shook hands, and explained their work. The villagers nodded politely, but there was a strange discomfort in their eyes. They were cautious, but also relieved. Maybe they were hoping the team could explain the late-night shaking that kept everyone awake. But no one brought it up at first. The team set up their tents near the hills where the vibrations were strongest. They unloaded boxes and metal instruments, laughing lightly, joking with each other. For them, this was routine. They started taking soil samples, digging small holes, and labeling bags with numbers and coordinates. One member, who was quieter than the others and liked to observe more than talk, noticed something unusual in the soil. It had a strange texture, like freshly broken rock, even though there was no digging nearby. Later, while walking alone along the hill's edge, he found something even stranger: a circular hole about the width of a bottle, dug deep into the ground. It looked too perfect to be natural. The edges were smooth, and it went down farther than he could see. It wasn't wide enough for a drill used by farmers or builders. He touched the edge, rubbed the dirt between his fingers, and felt cold metal pieces mixed inside the soil. It didn't make sense. He called the others to look. They gathered around the hole, confused. Someone suggested it might be from an old survey done by another team years before. Another joked that maybe someone was digging treasure. Yet no one could explain the precision of the hole or the metallic traces in the soil. They decided to take samples anyway and move on. They didn't realize that even noticing the hole was already a mistake. When evening came, they went to talk to the villagers to ask about the shaking. At first, the villagers denied anything was wrong. They insisted the earth was fine, that it was just wind or seasonal shifting. But one older man, sitting alone near a fire, finally spoke up after listening silently. He told them quietly that strangers had been visiting the hills at night. Not locals, not workers from the nearby farm's men, no one knew, who offered money to dig in secret. They carried heavy bags, tools that made no noise, and always left before sunrise. They never talked to the villagers except to offer cash for silence. At first, people refused, but when the money kept increasing, someone accepted. Then others followed. And soon more strangers came. They worked fast, always at night, always in the same area. The old man said he tried to warn others, but no one listened. Now, whoever questioned them received threats. So people stayed quiet. The team listened, suddenly more alert. That night, while the village slept, the geologists heard the ground tremble again. This time, they stayed awake to listen. It wasn't natural. It wasn't the wind. The vibrations came at regular intervals, stopping and starting like machinery. The sound was so faint that if someone was talking or walking, they wouldn't hear it. But in the silence, it was impossible to ignore. Something or someone was working below the surface. The next morning, they returned to the area where the hole was found. They walked farther into the hills, looking for more signs. Soon they found a second hole, then a third one, hidden behind bushes and rocks. Some were plugged with stones, others left open. The pattern didn't look random. It was as if someone had mapped out the land underground. The quiet observer of the group took photos, not just of the holes, but of the soil, the metallic traces, and the disturbed ground. His teammates told him photos were unnecessary and could cause trouble if shared publicly. But he believed documenting evidence was a simple scientific habit, nothing more. He didn't understand the danger yet. They decided to take more samples than originally planned, more than they were instructed to. They wanted to figure out what kind of rock was being extracted secretly at night. It felt like discovering something important. They didn't realize secrets often remain hidden for a reason. As the team packed their samples into bags, the villagers watched from a distance. Some looked nervous, others worried. The old man turned his face away. A woman whispered to another, as if warning her that the strangers might bring trouble again. The geologists had no idea how close they were to something that powerful people wanted to keep buried. Before leaving, the team noticed something else. Unfamiliar tire tracks leading up the hill, not from any village car or tractor. Drivers here used old vehicles, worn down by years of rough roads. But these tracks were clean, deep, and wide, clearly from heavy vehicles with expensive suspension. Whoever came at night was not poor, not local, and not just looking for simple minerals. But instead of alerting authorities right away, the team returned to their camp, wrote notes, labeled samples, and prepared reports. They believed they had stumbled onto a simple geological mystery that would impress their supervisors. They believed they had found something worth studying, something that might make their careers stronger. They didn't realize they had already stepped into a world where curiosity is not appreciated, a world where secrets were protected by threats, not by science. They came as ordinary researchers, and they still thought they were only doing research. They didn't notice the distant figure watching them from the hills. They didn't notice the phone calls being made quietly, alerting someone about their interest. They didn't see how the villagers stopped talking to them after the old man's warning. They thought they were doing their job. But the moment they tested that first piece of soil mixed with metal, the moment they photographed the drilled holes, and the moment they started asking questions, something far bigger than them began to move, something that didn't care about science, truth, or research. The team didn't know it yet, but they hadn't discovered anything. They had interfered. They had touched something they were never supposed to see. And the real trouble had only just begun. The morning after their first investigation, the team left the village to reach the nearest city, carrying bags full of soil samples and photos. They thought it would be easy to analyze everything, write a report, and move on. They didn't yet understand how serious their discovery could be. On the way, their conversations were light at first. They joked about the shaking ground, the strange holes, and the villagers' nervous glances. But under the laughter, there was tension, a quiet awareness that something unusual was happening. Once in the city, they started sending the samples to their institution. The labs were standard small machines, microscopes, some chemical tests, but the results shocked everyone. One sample had a composition that didn't make sense. It contained traces of uranium and other rare minerals. Some of it was dangerous, even in small amounts. No one in the team expected this. They were just geologists looking at soil and rocks, not radioactive materials. One member of the team, the quiet observer, remembered the photos he had taken of the drilled holes. Curious, he decided to share a few with a private online forum meant for researchers and enthusiasts. He thought it was safe, a way to show the strange geological patterns he had found. He didn't post the location, just pictures of the soil, the holes, and the disturbed ground. Within hours, he began to feel uneasy. The forum thread exploded with attention. People started asking questions, speculating about rare minerals, and suggesting that the site could be valuable for mining. At first, the team laughed at the attention. It felt good to be recognized for finding something unusual. But soon, strange things began to happen. The phone lines at their apartment started buzzing late at night. Unknown numbers called, and when they picked up, there was silence on the other side. A few times, they heard whispers, and then the call ended. At first, they thought it was pranksters or scammers. But the calls became more frequent and more intense. One afternoon, a man in a suit appeared at the door of their lab. He claimed to be from a government department, but refused to show identification. He asked questions about the samples, where they were collected, and what the photos showed. His tone was polite, but firm, almost threatening. The team felt a chill run down their spines. They were just researchers. They hadn't meant to interfere with anything illegal. Yet somehow they had drawn attention. The team realized that the village they had visited was no ordinary place. The holes and disturbed soil were not just signs of small-scale digging. Someone or some group had been secretly extracting rare minerals from the earth. The metals in the soil weren't meant to be found. They were part of an operation that no one outside wanted to know about. And now the team was in the middle of it. Despite the growing unease, the team decided to continue their research. They carefully documented everything: soil layers, the size of the holes, the unusual metallic traces, and the way the ground had been disturbed. Each piece of data felt more important than the last. But every new discovery also increased the danger they faced. Someone powerful was monitoring their activity. One evening, as they reviewed their photos, one of the team members noticed something alarming. In the background of one picture, barely visible, was a small figure crouched behind the bush, watching them. The figure's face was covered, and it was impossible to see who it was. They realized that someone had been following them in the village, watching every move, and had been waiting for the moment they left. Fear began to grow among the group. They discussed their options late into the night. Should they report their findings to higher authorities? Should they try to publish a paper? Or should they quietly stop and forget everything? Each option felt dangerous. Reporting, it could attract attention from the very people who wanted to keep the operation hidden. Publishing a paper could make them targets. And ignoring it felt impossible. They had seen something too important to ignore. Despite the fear, one of the team members decided to take a small risk. He contacted a journalist he trusted, someone known for investigating environmental and illegal mining issues. He sent only part of the data, carefully removing any details that could reveal the exact location. He hoped the journalist could help them find a safe way to expose what was happening without putting anyone in immediate danger. Almost immediately, the journalist responded with concern. He warned that the operation was not local. It was part of a larger network, possibly involving international actors. He said the team's discovery could be extremely dangerous for them if the wrong people found out. The journalist emphasized discretion and suggested that they avoid social media and public discussions. It became clear that they were dealing with something much bigger than they had ever imagined. The situation escalated quickly. Unknown men in unmarked vehicles were spotted near their apartment. They seemed to appear suddenly, watching from a distance and disappearing just as quickly. The team felt as if every move was being tracked. One night, while returning from the lab, they noticed a car slowly following them. Its windows were tinted, the engine barely audible. For the first time, they felt true fear, not the kind of fear from academic pressure or failing experiments, but fear for their personal safety. Meanwhile, back in the village, life continued in a tense silence. The miners and locals were too afraid to speak openly. Some had seen the team leave with samples, and whispers spread that outsiders were involved. The people who had been paid to dig in secret became anxious. They knew that if the wrong person investigated, they could lose everything or worse. The villagers learned quickly that curiosity and discovery could bring danger, not reward. The team also began to notice health problems in themselves. A few complained of headaches, dizziness, and nausea. Initially, they dismissed it as stress or lack of sleep. But one of them remembered that the soil samples contained uranium traces. They had handled it without realizing the potential risk. They went for medical checkups and were advised to avoid further exposure. Fear mixed with guilt. They had not only exposed themselves to danger, but they had also put the villagers at risk by bringing attention to the site. Despite the risks, they felt they couldn't stop. They gathered more data carefully, avoiding attention, and tried to understand the scope of what was happening. They documented how the soil had been disturbed over time, how the holes were positioned in a pattern, and how rare the metals found in the soil were. Each discovery made it clear that the operation was highly organized and valuable. It was bigger than any illegal mining they had ever imagined, and it had powerful people protecting it. Tension reached its peak one evening when a government official arrived at their apartment. This time, the official had proper identification but delivered a strict warning. He told the team to stop their investigation immediately. He said the data they had collected was sensitive and that any further attempts to analyze or share it could be considered a threat to national security. The official's tone was serious, almost cold, and the team realized there was no simple way to continue safely. They debated what to do next. The data they had collected could save lives if it exposed dangerous operations, but continuing could also endanger them. Each person in the team had a different opinion. Some wanted to abandon the project and go home. Others insisted that the truth needed to be revealed, no matter the cost. They agreed to take the safest route possible. They would gather evidence quietly, without alerting the public, and work with trusted individuals outside the operation. The team also realized that time was critical. The longer the operation continued, the more difficult it would be to stop it. They needed to act strategically, balancing the need for evidence with the need for safety. Every phone call, every movement, and every photograph had to be carefully considered. One wrong step could have serious consequences, not just for them, but for the villagers who were already living in fear. As Part 2 drew to a close, the team faced a sobering truth. They had stumbled upon something much larger than themselves, something powerful enough to manipulate governments and silence communities. The operation they had uncovered was not a simple crime. It was part of a network that could operate undetected for years. Their discovery, though unintentional, had triggered a chain of events that could not be undone. And while they had no idea of the full extent of the danger yet, one thing was certain: they could never go back to being ordinary researchers. Their actions had consequences, and they were now part of a story that could change lives, challenge power, and reveal truths that many wanted to keep hidden. The war had already begun quiet, invisible, and dangerous. And the team, who had only intended to study soil, had unknowingly become key players in it. The village remained quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that made people uneasy. Life went on, but the air was thick with tension. Every footstep at night seemed louder than it was. Every shadow in the distance felt like a threat. The villagers had grown used to keeping their heads down, to pretending that nothing unusual was happening. They avoided talking about the holes in the hills, the men who came at night, and the strange tremors in the ground. But since the geologists had visited, something had changed. Some of the villagers had been involved in the digging. At first, they had thought of it as a way to make extra money. The strangers paid well, and in a poor village, that was an offer hard to refuse. They didn't ask many questions. They only followed orders. Dig here, dig there, fill the holes, and take the dirt away. But the moment the geologists showed up with their cameras and questions, the villagers realized that what they were doing could be dangerous. Late one evening, a miner who had been paid to dig secretly confided in a neighbor. He said he had seen strange machines that moved under the ground, machines that no ordinary person could operate. He said the men who ran the operation carried weapons, and if anyone asked too many questions, they would disappear. The neighbor listened in silence, her face pale. She had seen some of these men herself, and knew the threat was real. The geologists had left the village, but their presence had changed everything. The miners became nervous, watching every night for signs of outsiders. They stopped digging as much, worried that their work might be exposed. Some even hid the tools and materials used for the excavation. Fear had begun to spread through the community, and people no longer trusted each other as much as they had before. Meanwhile, the young researcher who had taken photos began to feel the consequences of sharing them online. The images had circulated quietly, but not unnoticed. Someone powerful had seen them, and from that moment, the team was being watched more closely than ever. Vehicles appeared near their lab at unusual hours, and strangers lingered on the street, always just out of reach. Even simple errands felt dangerous because they never knew who was observing them. The villagers did not know the geologists' names, nor did they understand exactly what the team had found. But they knew that something serious was happening, and it involved people far beyond their tiny village. The old man who had first warned them became even quieter. He stopped sitting by the fire in the evenings, stopped talking to anyone, and spent long hours staring at the hills. It was as if he was trying to predict what would happen next, but he didn't know either. One morning, a group of villagers noticed fresh tire tracks along the hills where the geologists had taken their soil samples. The tracks were from large vehicles, unlike anything the villagers owned. They seemed to appear suddenly, as though the vehicles had come out of nowhere. The villagers watched from their homes, their hearts pounding, afraid that the men would come looking for them, or for the people who had spoken to the outsiders. The miners began whispering among themselves. Some suggested leaving the village altogether, fearing that they were now part of something much bigger than they could handle. Others argued that leaving would only draw attention. The strangers who ran the operations would know someone had fled, and that could bring trouble to the families left behind. They felt trapped between fear and survival. At the same time, the geologists continued their work in the city, unaware of the full extent of the fear they had triggered. They analyzed soil samples, calculated the mineral content, and tried to understand the scale of what was happening underground. They learned that the metals were rare and highly valuable, which explained why so many resources had been devoted to keeping the digging secret. But the more they discovered, the more they realized how dangerous it was to know too much. One day, the team decided to reach out to a trusted journalist again. They wanted to share the story safely, without revealing names or locations. The journalist advised them to gather as much evidence as possible, but to avoid direct contact with anyone involved in the operation. He warned that powerful people would go to great lengths to protect their interests, and even a small mistake could put lives at risk. Meanwhile, in the village, the fear had begun to affect everyday life. Children no longer played freely in the hills, and families avoided the areas where the holes were. Farmers noticed that animals were restless at night, and some livestock disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The old routines were gone, replaced by anxiety and suspicion. People whispered about what the geologists had seen and what the strangers had done. But no one spoke too loudly. The quiet observer of the geologists' team often thought about the villagers. He wondered how they must be feeling, living with the threat of unseen forces controlling their lives. He realized that their presence had unintentionally put the villagers in danger. It was a heavy thought, one that stayed with him through the nights. When he couldn't sleep, one evening, the team received an unexpected message. It was a warning, not a direct threat, but enough to make their hearts race. The message said simply, "Stop. You do not know what you are dealing with." There was no signature, no explanation, just a warning. The team knew it was from the people running the operation, the same ones who had been digging in the hills and who had likely followed them ever since, the villagers. On the other hand, we're beginning to see the impact of the team's visit in another way. Some of the miners who had stayed silent were now hesitant to work at all. They worried that every dig, every movement of soil could attract attention. They were caught between the need to earn money and the fear of becoming targets. Some families considered moving away, leaving their homes behind. But the cost of moving was too high for most, and so they stayed, trapped in the anxiety that had taken over their lives. The old man who had first spoken to the geologists now spent hours talking to anyone willing to listen, sharing what he had seen and what he had heard. He warned that the operation beneath the hills was not a simple local project. It involved outsiders with access to money, weapons, and influence. He tried to convince the miners to be careful, to hide their work, and to speak only when absolutely necessary. His voice carried the weight of experience, but even he did not know how far-reaching the consequences would be. Back in the city, the geologists worked quietly, but the pressure was mounting. They knew they had stumbled onto something dangerous, yet they also felt a responsibility to act. Each sample, each photo, each observation carried information that could expose the operation and prevent harm. But acting too openly could invite retaliation. They were caught between the desire to reveal the truth and the need to protect themselves. They decided to take extra precautions. Meetings were held in private locations, and digital communications were encrypted. They avoided posting anything online, and they spoke only to the journalist who understood the risks. The team worked long hours, often through the night, piecing together the data and trying to understand the scale of what they had discovered. It was exhausting, both mentally and emotionally. In the village, the fear had reached new levels. Families no longer trusted each other fully, worried that anyone could be an informant. The children learned to play quietly, keeping away from the hills. Even small tasks, like fetching water or tending animals, were done with caution. Every creak of a door, every rustle in the bushes, could trigger fear. The community that had once been close and supportive was now fragmented by suspicion and anxiety. Despite the tension, a few villagers quietly helped each other. They shared information about the strangers who came at night, helped hide tools, and warned neighbors when they saw anything unusual. These small acts of courage went unnoticed by outsiders, but they created a fragile network of trust that allowed some families to survive without attracting attention. Meanwhile, the geologists continued to analyze the rare minerals in the soil. They learned that the metals were extremely valuable, likely worth millions, and that controlling them was important to powerful people. It explained why the operation was so secretive and why so many measures had been taken to protect it. The team realized that they were now in a position where their knowledge could have serious consequences. Every decision they made mattered. The team held meetings to discuss their next steps. They debated whether to report the findings officially, continue collecting data, or try to find a way to expose the operation safely. Each option had risks, and there were no easy answers. They knew that acting recklessly could put them and the villagers in immediate danger. But doing nothing could allow the operation to continue unchecked. By the end of Part 3, the reality of the situation had become clear. The geologists had unknowingly triggered a dangerous sequence of events. The villagers were living in fear, the miners were uncertain about their safety, and the operation continued in secrecy. The team realized that they were now part of a much larger story, one where curiosity and discovery had consequences far beyond what they had ever imagined. And while they had not yet seen the full scale of the operation, they understood one thing: their actions had consequences, and every move from this point forward would need to be calculated, cautious, and deliberate. The quiet war between knowledge and secrecy had begun, and life for the geologists had become tense in a way they had never imagined. What started as a simple research trip had now turned into a quiet war where every step mattered. The city, once familiar and safe, now felt unpredictable. Every shadow on the street, every glance from a stranger seemed loaded with potential danger. Even friends and neighbors were approached cautiously. The team had learned that curiosity was no longer just a scientific trait, it had become a risk. One evening, as the team returned to their apartment from the lab, they noticed a car parked across the street. Its windows were darkly tinted, and the engine hummed quietly. At first, they thought it was coincidence, a car belonging to someone in the neighborhood. But the same car appeared night after night, often in different locations, but always nearby. It was no accident. Someone was following them, watching them, and keeping track of their movements. Inside their apartment, the atmosphere was tense. The team sat together, quietly reviewing the day's findings, when the quiet observer noticed something alarming. Small scratches appeared on the doors and windows. At first, he thought it was from ordinary wear and tear, but the scratches formed subtle patterns that suggested someone had been trying to see inside without being noticed. They realized that the observers were skilled, careful, and patient. Whoever was tracking them wasn't just powerful, they were methodical. The following morning, a government official arrived at the lab. Unlike the previous visitor, this one had proper identification, but the demeanor was chilling. The official didn't shout or threaten directly. Instead, he spoke with calm authority. "Stop your investigation immediately," he said. "The data you have collected involves materials and operations classified under national security. Any further attempts to study, analyze, or share this information will be considered a threat to public safety and security." The team sat in stunned silence. They were scientists, not activists or spies. They had never imagined that studying soil could put them in conflict with the government. But now it was clear. Their work had triggered something far bigger than they could comprehend. The official's warning was polite, but the weight behind it made them shiver. It was a clear message. Continue, and there would be consequences. As the official left, the team realized that they could no longer act openly. Every experiment, every test, and every piece of evidence needed to be handled with extreme caution. Their communications became encrypted, their meetings private, and their movements deliberate. Even small tasks, like grocery shopping or taking public transport, were done carefully to avoid drawing attention. Every day felt like walking a tightrope. Meanwhile, in the village, the miners were beginning to feel the pressure more directly. The strangers who had been working at night had become noticeably more aggressive. One night, a miner who had been digging was confronted by men in black uniforms. They didn't speak much, but their presence was enough to intimidate. The miner returned home shaken, refusing to talk to anyone. The villagers watched in silence, knowing that any word could put the whole community at risk. The quiet observer of the geologists' team often thought about the villagers. He imagined the fear that must have gripped them. The men digging in secret, the tremors in the ground, the unmarked vehicles, they had all experienced it. Now, Because of the geologist's investigation, that fear had intensified. He felt a growing responsibility toward the people whose lives had been unknowingly affected by their curiosity. Back in the city, the team decided they needed help, but also needed to remain anonymous. They reached out to the journalists they trusted. They shared selective information, enough to explain the dangers, but not enough to reveal identities or locations. The journalist responded quickly, emphasizing discretion. He explained that the operation they had uncovered was extensive, possibly involving international interests. It was not simply a local or regional problem. It was a network that could operate far beyond the village, and it had the resources to silence anyone who became a threat. The team knew the warning was serious. They had already seen traces of surveillance, the vehicles, the mysterious calls, the patterns of scratches on their apartment. But the journalist's explanation made them understand the scale. They were not just being watched, they were being evaluated. Someone was measuring how far they were willing to go, how much they knew, and how much risk they could pose. One afternoon, as they discussed their next steps, the apartment doorbell rang unexpectedly. No one was supposed to be visiting. The team froze. Cautiously, they approached, and one of them peeked through the peephole. Outside stood a man in plain clothes, holding a folder. He smiled politely, but there was no warmth in his eyes. "I hear you've been collecting some interesting data," he said calmly. "I'm here to help you understand what's at stake." Inside, the man explained that the operation beneath the village was far more than anyone had imagined. The metals being extracted were highly valuable, not just financially, but strategically. Governments, private organizations, and international networks had stakes in controlling them. That was why secrecy was maintained at such a high level. Any unauthorized investigation, even by well-meaning researchers, could threaten interests that had spent years protecting this information. The team listened carefully, realizing that every step they had taken had been noticed and evaluated. The man's demeanor was calm, but his presence was a warning. He implied that mistakes would not be tolerated. Even a small leak, a careless post online, or a discussion with outsiders could trigger consequences. The geologists understood then that their lives and the safety of the villagers could be at risk. Over the next few days, the pressure increased. The team noticed subtle changes in their surroundings. Cars parked across streets, shadows lingering in alleyways, and strangers appearing briefly in public places only to vanish. At the same time, their personal devices began acting strangely. Phones received untraceable calls, emails went missing or bounced back, and their computers occasionally froze without explanation. It became clear that their entire environment was being monitored. In the village, the miners had begun adjusting their routines. They avoided digging at night, hid tools more carefully, and communicated in whispers. Fear had become a constant companion. Families avoided going out after dark, and even essential tasks were carried out with caution. The once quiet village was now tense, every sound carrying the possibility of danger. Despite all this, the geologists felt an obligation to continue. They knew the truth could prevent harm, even if it placed them at risk. Each day, they carefully reviewed the soil samples, documented patterns, and calculated the extent of the underground operations. They discussed strategies to gather information safely, considering encryption, anonymous reporting, and limited exposure. Every action had to be deliberate. One wrong move could undo months of careful work. One night, a team member stayed behind at the lab while the others returned home. Alone, he noticed movement outside the window, a figure slowly walking along the sidewalk, pausing occasionally as if observing. Fear gripped him, but he remembered the lessons from the journalist. Remain calm, do not confront, document if possible. He recorded the figure without making noise, and after a while, the person disappeared into the shadows. It was another reminder that the operation had eyes everywhere at the same time. The journalist advised them to focus on patterns rather than immediate details. By studying the behavior of the operation, the team could understand the broader structure without exposing themselves. They began to map activities, noting when vehicles appeared, when messages were sent, and when the miners in the village changed their behavior. Slowly, a picture of the operation emerged. It was not random. It was organized, and it had far-reaching influence. The tension escalated when a small mishap occurred. One team member accidentally left a file open on a shared computer in a public space. Within hours, someone unknown attempted to access the network remotely. The intrusion was minor, but it sent a clear message. The team's movements and information were being monitored continuously. From that moment, they became even more cautious, using secure communication methods and limiting physical exposure. Despite the fear and constant surveillance, the geologists continued to process the soil data. Each discovery reinforced the significance of the operation. The metals extracted were rare and strategic, valuable to multiple powerful entities. It explained why the men in the village, the mysterious vehicles, and the government warnings were all so coordinated. This was no simple illegal mining. It was a carefully protected operation with high-stakes. As Part 4 drew to a close, the geologists faced the reality of their situation. They had entered a world far beyond their initial understanding. Their curiosity had triggered attention, their actions had consequences, and the forces they were now aware of were patient, methodical, and powerful. Every decision from this point forward would carry weight, and the line between observation and danger had become thinner than ever. The quiet war had become visible. The observers were no longer just shadows. They were strategic, calculating, and ready to act. And the geologists, who had only wanted to study soil and rocks, realized that they were now part of a story where survival, knowledge, and truth were tightly inter. By now, the geologists had realized that their lives and the lives of the villagers were caught in something much larger than anyone could have imagined. It was no longer just about strange holes in the hills or unusual soil samples. Their curiosity had triggered an invisible war, one that stretched far beyond the village and even beyond the borders of their country. Every day brought a new sense of tension, a reminder that someone, somewhere, was watching their every move. The team continued to work cautiously. Each member had developed habits to reduce risk. Phones were used only when necessary. Computers were heavily encrypted, and meetings were held in secret locations far from the city center. Even walking outside had become a calculated decision. They avoided familiar streets, watched for cars that appeared repeatedly, and never went anywhere alone. It was exhausting, both mentally and physically, but they knew they had no choice. One morning, the quiet observer noticed something unusual in the soil data. Patterns in the underground excavation indicated that the operation was more organized than they had thought. The holes weren't random. They followed a precise grid. The metal traces were concentrated in certain areas, and the soil had been shifted in ways that suggested a long-term extraction plan. Whoever was running the operation knew exactly what they were doing, and they had resources to ensure secrecy. The team decided to document everything carefully. They created digital maps, recorded every sample, and noted every anomaly. At the same time, they kept in contact with a trusted journalist, sharing information in a way that would not reveal identities or locations. The journalist advised them to focus on long-term patterns rather than immediate details. This would help them expose the operation without putting themselves at immediate risk. Meanwhile, the villagers continued to live under constant fear. The miners who had once worked at night were now even more cautious. Some refused to dig entirely, worried that any activity could bring the attention of the powerful outsiders. Others tried to continue in secret, but anxiety had replaced confidence. Families moved less, Children played quietly, and even casual conversations were whispered. The atmosphere in the village was tense, filled with an unspoken understanding that danger was always near. One evening, as the geologists were reviewing their data, a sudden knock at the door startled them. It was not unusual for someone to visit unexpectedly, but this knock felt different. The sound was firm, deliberate. When they opened the door, they found a man standing there, calm but serious. He did not introduce himself fully. Instead, he said, "I know what you are doing. Stop now, or you will face consequences." The team felt a chill run down their spines. This was no polite warning from a government official or a distant stranger. This was a personal message, delivered to their doorstep. The man turned and walked away without another word, leaving the team in silence. They realized that the operation was not only monitoring them remotely, it could act directly, immediately, and without warning. From that moment, the stakes became painfully clear. The team could not continue openly. Every step, every conversation, every analysis had to be carefully calculated. Even small mistakes could be dangerous. Yet they also knew that stopping entirely was not an option. The operation continued underground, extracting valuable minerals and leaving the villagers exposed to risk. Someone had to understand the truth and find a way to act safely. The team began strategizing in new ways. They decided to split tasks carefully, so no single person held all the information. This would reduce risk if someone was targeted. They also began using secure drop points for samples, avoiding predictable patterns. Meetings with the journalist became scheduled at irregular hours, using locations that were difficult to trace. Every decision was weighed against the potential danger, but the work continued. In the village, the tension was rising. One night, a miner accidentally left a small tool near the excavation site. It was noticed by the men who controlled the operation, who visited quietly to check the work. They spoke little, but their presence was intimidating. The miner returned home shaken, explaining to his family that the strangers were watching everything, measuring every move. Fear became more than a feeling. It became a way of life. The geologists received news that added another layer of urgency. Through their encrypted communication with the journalist, they learned that similar operations existed in other regions. The pattern was global, involving organized extraction of rare and valuable minerals. The operation in the village was just one part of a much larger network, which explained the extreme secrecy and the power of those involved. It was no longer a local problem, it was international, and the potential consequences of exposure were enormous. Despite the mounting danger, the team made slow progress. Each new piece of information helped them understand the operation's scope. They documented patterns of extraction, identified times when monitoring was lighter, and mapped the most active areas. The work was painstaking, requiring patience and extreme care. At the same time, they kept the villagers in mind, aware that the information could help protect them if used correctly. One evening, a troubling message arrived through the journalist. It warned that the operation had become aware of the team's activity. They were no longer being observed quietly. They were now being tested. The message emphasized the need for extreme caution. Any attempt to expose the operation publicly could provoke immediate retaliation. The warning was a clear signal that the stakes had escalated. The invisible war was moving into a new phase, where inaction could be as dangerous as action. The team also began noticing subtle signs of interference with their communications. Emails bounced unexpectedly, files were deleted, and phone calls disconnected without explanation. Someone was actively monitoring them, not just observing, but interfering with their work. The sense of being trapped intensified. Every decision, every small action could draw attention. Every movement was calculated against the unknown reach of the operation. Back in the village, the pressure on the miners increased. Some families began to plan for the possibility of leaving, though the cost of relocation was high. Others tried to continue their routines while avoiding risk. The children remained close to home, playing quietly, always aware of the threat. Even the older villagers, who had once been confident and steady, became cautious and fearful. The presence of strangers, coupled with the knowledge of the geologists. Investigation had changed the fabric of the community. One night, a minor accident occurred. A small hole in the excavation site collapsed, injuring a miner slightly. Although it was not severe, it caught the attention of the men controlling the operation. They arrived to inspect the site, moving quietly but with purpose. The miner's family feared the worst, and for the first time, the villagers understood that mistakes could have direct consequences. It was no longer about fear of discovery alone. It was about immediate, personal danger. The geologists, meanwhile, decided to focus on patterns rather than individual details. By studying the timing of operations, the movement of vehicles, and the location of extracted minerals, they could gain insight into the operation without exposing themselves directly. The work was slow and deliberate, but it allowed them to make progress safely. It also helped them plan a potential strategy for exposing the operation in a controlled way, with minimal risk to themselves and the villagers. Despite all precautions, the team felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier. Their discovery had altered lives, created fear, and drawn the attention of powerful forces. They could no longer act as ordinary scientists. Their decisions carried consequences far beyond their understanding. The invisible war had intensified, and they were at the center of it. The journalist continued to guide them, providing advice on safe communication and helping analyze patterns without exposing identities. Through him, the team learned more about the global network that the operation was part of. It was a sophisticated system, organized with precision, and protected by both legal and illegal means. The scale of it was almost incomprehensible, and yet the villagers' lives were entwined with it in ways that were both dangerous and fragile. By the end of Part 5, the geologists faced a stark reality. They were now deeply involved in a conflict that was both invisible and highly dangerous. Every piece of evidence they collected, every observation they made, and every decision they took had the potential to trigger consequences. The villagers remained in a state of cautious fear, and the operation continued its work in secrecy. The balance between knowledge, safety, and responsibility had never been more delicate, and while the geologists had survived this far, they knew that the war was far from over. The invisible forces they were dealing with were patient, powerful, and methodical. The coming days would demand courage, strategy, and unwavering caution. Every step forward was a risk, every decision mattered, and the line between success and disaster had never been thinner. The days following the last warning were tense, and the team felt the weight of every choice. They knew that the operation they had discovered was more powerful than they had imagined, and any careless move could put themselves or the villagers in immediate danger. Yet they also understood that ignoring the truth was no longer an option. The knowledge they had gained could prevent serious harm if used carefully, and that responsibility rested heavily on their shoulders. Back in the village, life continued under a tense silence. The miners had learned to act cautiously, and families avoided any unnecessary movement. Children played quietly close to their homes, watching the hills from a distance. Even the animals seemed affected, restless during the night, moving in strange patterns. Fear had become a constant companion for the villagers, but they had also learned to watch for small signs, subtle hints that could keep them safe. One evening, a team member received an encrypted message from the journalist. It suggested a controlled approach to exposing the operation. Instead of attempting to confront it directly, the idea was to create a chain of evidence that could be shared with authorities in a safe way, minimizing exposure while still ensuring accountability. The team realized this was the safest path forward, but it would require patience, careful planning, and precise execution. The team split tasks carefully to reduce risk. One member focused entirely on mapping patterns of the underground extraction. Another analyzed the composition of the metals, noting which areas were most active. The quiet observer continued documenting everything through photographs and detailed notes. Communication was kept strictly on secure channels, and meetings were arranged in places that could not be easily monitored. Every action was deliberate and calculated. In the village, the miners started to notice subtle changes. Some of the strangers who had been working at night had begun to leave in smaller numbers, as if their supervisors were assessing the situation. Fear and uncertainty dominated their work. Some families considered leaving, but resources were limited, and moving could attract attention. They stayed, relying on careful observation, quiet warning systems, and trust built between neighbors. Even small acts, like covering a hole or hiding tools, were carefully planned to avoid notice. As the team continued their analysis, they uncovered something unexpected. The patterns of extraction suggested that the operation had a weakness. It depended heavily on secrecy and predictable routines. If exposure could be managed in a precise way, it could slow or even halt the work temporarily. This realization gave the team a sense of cautious hope. They understood that timing and method were critical. Any misstep could trigger retaliation. The journalist coordinated with trusted contacts to ensure that the evidence could be delivered safely. This required weeks of preparation, encrypting data, creating backups, and confirming that no one could trace their communications. The team also learned to observe without being observed, blending into ordinary routines while tracking the operation's movements. Slowly, the pieces of a careful strategy began to come together. At the same time, the villagers continued to live under the shadow of the operation. Every night, the tremors in the hills reminded them that someone was extracting valuable materials right beneath their feet. Some villagers could no longer sleep peacefully. Even those who had previously ignored the holes and strange activity now watched carefully, looking for signs of change. Fear was constant, but so was a quiet determination to survive. One day, an unexpected event accelerated the situation. A miner accidentally revealed the presence of the operation to someone outside the village, a passerby who was curious about the strange activity. This breach could have triggered a disaster, but the team's careful planning allowed them to intervene. Through encrypted communication with the journalist, the information was managed carefully to prevent widespread exposure. It was a tense reminder of how fragile their situation remained. The team continued to gather evidence, documenting soil patterns, vehicle movements, and signs of underground extraction. Each discovery confirmed what they had feared. The operation was well-funded, highly organized, and dangerous. Yet the careful, systematic approach they had developed allowed them to work without attracting immediate attention. Every piece of information brought them closer to understanding the full scope of the operation and how it could be stopped safely. Meanwhile, the villagers began to notice subtle changes. Some of the strangers no longer arrived at the usual hours. Others were fewer in number, and certain areas of the hills seemed untouched for days. The miners whispered about these changes, wondering if the operation had shifted focus or if their careful actions were being noticed. Small successes gave them hope, but fear remained because they understood that the operation's power was still strong. The team finally decided it was time to act more decisively. They prepared a detailed report with photographs, maps, and soil analyses. The report did not include names or locations, but outlined patterns, the scale of extraction, and the potential risks to communities and the environment. The evidence was compiled in a way that could be shared with authorities safely, ensuring accountability without endangering anyone unnecessarily. Once the report was ready, The journalist helped coordinate its delivery to trusted officials. The process required weeks of careful planning, verifying contacts, ensuring secure transmission, and confirming that no one outside the trusted network could intercept the information. It was a delicate process, but the team knew that it was the safest way to make a real impact. As the report reached authorities, the team watched anxiously. Days passed with no response. The villagers, too, remained cautious, unsure if their quiet vigilance had been noticed or if the operation had reacted to the new threat. The team knew that the next few weeks could determine the outcome of everything: the safety of the villagers, the continuation of the operation, and their own lives. Then, gradually, changes began to appear. The frequency of strangers visiting the village decreased. Vehicles no longer lingered as long, and the men working underground were fewer and less coordinated. It was not clear whether the operation had paused, shifted locations, or simply become more cautious, but the team recognized the change as a small victory. Their careful approach, patience, and planning had created a space for influence without provoking immediate retaliation. The villagers noticed the difference, too. Although fear did not disappear completely, a sense of relief began to spread. Families could move more freely, children played in the hills under careful supervision, and everyday life began to return to a cautious normal. The miners continued to work, but with an understanding of the need for discretion and observation. A quiet sense of resilience emerged in the community. The team, while relieved, remained vigilant. They knew that the operation was still active somewhere, and that any careless action could draw attention again. They continued to monitor patterns, maintain secure communication, and document evidence. The experience had changed them profoundly. They were no longer just researchers. They had become observers, protectors, and strategists in a war they had not asked to fight. Over time, the villagers grew more confident. They understood the risks, but they had also learned how to navigate them. Families helped each other, quietly sharing warnings, monitoring activity, and maintaining safe routines. The hills, once a source of fear, became a symbol of survival, resilience, and careful observation. The community had been tested, and though the scars of fear remained, so did the strength they had discovered in themselves. For the geologists, the experience left a lasting impact. They had begun as scientists, curious about soil and minerals, and ended as participants in a larger story of secrecy, power, and human resilience. They had learned the importance of caution, patience, and strategy in the face of forces far beyond their control. More importantly, they had discovered the value of responsibility, not just for knowledge, but for the lives their work affected. The operation itself, though slowed, continued in secret. The team knew that it was far from fully stopped, but the careful exposure and documentation had created a safeguard. Authorities were now aware of patterns, risks, and potential dangers, and the villagers had a new understanding of the world around them. The balance of secrecy and awareness had shifted slightly, giving them a measure of safety that had not existed before. In the end, the geologists returned to a quieter life, though they were forever changed. They carried the memory of fear, tension, and careful strategy, but also the knowledge that patient, thoughtful action could influence even the most powerful forces. The villagers continued their lives with caution, but also with a renewed sense of awareness and resilience. What had begun as a simple study of soil had grown into a story of courage, observation, and survival. And while the hidden war beneath the hills continued quietly, the community had learned to navigate it. The geologists had learned that knowledge carried responsibility, curiosity carried risk, and even in the face of invisible danger, careful, deliberate action could make a difference. The story ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a cautious, hard-earned balance where lives were preserved, secrets were exposed safely, and lessons about courage, patience, and human resilience were